Once, in a time when the very earth seemed to hold echoes of ancient, colossal beings, there lived a king whose pride reached higher than the jagged mountains of his domain. His name was Og, King of Bashan, a name whispered in awe and dread across the ancient world. He was a man of such immense stature, a remnant of the legendary Rephaim, that his very bed, a chilling testament to his scale and self-importance, had to be forged from solid iron. It was not for comfort, but for sheer necessity, for no mere wood could bear the crushing weight of his colossal body, nor, more significantly, the oppressive weight of his unyielding pride. This is not merely a tale of physical might, but a profound spiritual narrative that delves into the ultimate question: what happens when a man, or a nation, believes itself too great, too secure, too powerful, even for God himself? Og was more than a mere warlord. He was a living monument, a towering figure from an age where raw power decreed law and terror enforced order. His formidable throne, carved from basalt and ancient stones, stood as a testament to rituals and traditions older than human memory. His people did not merely serve him, they feared him with a primal, visceral fear, and in their awe, they even ascribed to him a divine aura. They called him the living pillar, the thunder of the north, even son of the watchers, and Og, in his colossal arrogance, believed every word. Yet, this is not the story of a king at the zenith of his glory, basking in the unassailable power he believed he possessed. No, this is the gripping, humbling story of his fall, the dramatic collapse of the last of the Rephaim, the giant who dared to defy the commands of Moses, and, more catastrophically, to stand in direct opposition to the living God of Israel. Because what ultimately brought King Og of Bashan down was not the conventional might of an army. It wasn't the overwhelming numbers of Israel's nomadic tribes, nor the sharp edge of their swords. It was something far more profound, something he could not see, something he could not comprehend, and most terrifyingly for him, something he could not possibly stop. It was a presence, unseen and unheard, yet undeniably felt, not a gust of wind, not a discernible sound, but the holy hush that descends before divine judgment. It was a weight, not felt on the skin or crushing the bones, but pressing down upon the very soul. A divine pressure he couldn't name, couldn't articulate, but most assuredly, couldn't deny. The night before the climactic battle, an unsettling shift occurred across the land of Bashan. The normally clear skies above Og's fortresses darkened ominously, not with storm clouds, but with an almost palpable sense of foreboding. The wind, usually a familiar companion through the basalt hills, turned strangely, carrying with it a chilling premonition. Even the wild animals, instinctively sensing the unnatural disquiet, fled from the hills, seeking refuge from an unseen terror. And from across the desolate valley, the camp of Israel, usually a source of muted sounds and flickering fires, now echoed with a sound that was profoundly alien to Og's understanding of warfare. It was not the clamor of soldiers sharpening blades, nor the boastful shouts of warriors preparing for bloodshed, but the resonant, unwavering sound of worship. And that night, for the very first time in his long, tyrannical life, Og, the most feared man in all the land of Bashan, the unmovable biblical giantaire, found that he could not sleep. His immense frame, usually impervious to discomfort or anxiety, thrummed with an unfamiliar tension. Because what was approaching that night was far more than a mere enemy army. It was a reckoning, a divine appointment that had been set long before he ever built his first fortress. So, I urge you, stay with me on this journey, for the fall of this mighty Ullur's biblical giant isn't just an ancient story, confined to dusty scrolls and forgotten ages. It is a profound warning, a stark mirror reflecting our own human frailties, and an eternal reminder that no throne, no empire, no life built solely on the unstable foundation of pride can ever stand when God Himself steps onto the field of battle, whether it be a physical one or the battleground of the human heart. This story serves as a timeless testament to the fall of King Og, a narrative deeply embedded in the heart of God's sovereignty over all human endeavors, long before the children of Israel miraculously crossed the Jordan River, before Moses, the great prophet, raised his staff to part the Red Sea, or Joshua, his successor, ever whispered his first prayer as a leader. There was Bashan. It was a land of deep shadows and stark, unforgiving stone, where towering cliffs pierced the very sky and ancient, gnarled trees whispered names long forgotten, names of the fallen and the proud. And towering above it all, a colossus amongst men, was a man born not just of flesh and blood but of legend itself, Og, as King Og of Bashan. But Og was not always a king. He began his life as a child wandering among those very hills, walking beside his father through the cavernous basalt formations and through ancient groves carved by the relentless sculptor of time. His people, the Rephaim, were descendants of a lineage of giants, not merely in their imposing physical size, but in their deeply ingrained legacy of strength and self-reliance. They were the last echoes of a bygone age, a primal time when men bowed to no god, but their own unyielding strength, their own indomitable will. Og's father, a formidable man in his own right, once imparted a profound, almost prophetic wisdom to his young, burgeoning son. Strength, my son, is a powerful gift, a formidable advantage. But be warned, it becomes a terrible curse when it refuses to kneel, when it refuses to acknowledge anything greater than itself. Those words, once spoken with solemnity and gravitas, undoubtedly resonated with young Og, lingering in his mind, until, as he grew, they gradually faded into the background, eclipsed by his burgeoning hunger for power. As Og matured, so too did his insatiable hunger. It wasn't merely a desire for more territory, for expanding the boundaries of his already vast kingdom. No, his hunger was for something far more profound, for permanence, for an unshakable legacy, for a monument to his own self-proclaimed invincibility. He commanded that roads be carved directly into the very mountains, defying nature itself. He oversaw the construction of fortresses so colossal, so incredibly high, that they seemed to swallow the very sun, casting long, dark shadows over his domain. And when even the strongest wood groaned and cracked beneath his immense weight, he issued a decree: a bed, a symbol of his power and unique status, must be forged from solid iron. This was not for the simple purpose of rest, for Og rarely seemed to truly rest, but purely for display, a tangible declaration of his unmatched might and the weight of his absolute sovereignty. His people, awestruck and terrified, bestowed upon him grand, almost deific titles: the living pillar, the thunder of the north, even son of the watchers, a subtle nod to the ancient, mysterious beings of primordial times. And Og, in his unyielding self-delusion, believed every single word, allowing their fear and adulation to inflate his already gargantuan ego. He scoffed, openly and derisively, at the whispered stories of Israel. Slaves, he mused, a ragtag band of wanderers following a prophet, and a seemingly whimsical pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. What could such pathetic, superstitious desert fanatics possibly know of true power, of conquest, of the unyielding strength that built an empire? He would often sit on his imposing, iron beds, which served as his throne during his more private moments, lifting heavy goblets of rich, dark wine, and dismiss them with a wave of his massive hand. Mere desert fanatics, fairy tales with sandals, a fleeting, irrelevant nuisance. But deep within the valleys, beyond the impregnable walls of his fortresses, the rumors, like insidious dust on the wind, continued to spread. Whispers of a sea that had miraculously parted, of devastating plagues unleashed upon Egypt, of a people who marched without chariots or conventional armies, yet before whom mighty cities inexplicably crumbled and fell. Stories circulated of a prophet who had ascended a mountain, shrouded in fire and smoke, and then vanished, leaving behind a new, equally mysterious leader whose very silence seemed to speak louder than the most thunderous war drums. Og, in his mounting irritation, tried to ignore it all, to dismiss it as mere superstition, until one fateful night, a scout, one of his most trusted and resilient warriors, returned from the desert marches. He was barely breathing, his mouth caked with the fine dust of the plains, blood staining his tunic, and his eyes, wide and dilated, held an expression that Og, the formidable king, had rarely if ever seen before. It was terror, raw and unconcealed. "They march, my king," the man whispered, his voice hoarse and broken, "and they sing." Og, with a practiced effort, forced a mocking smile to his lips, but something deep within him, something long buried beneath layers of hardened stone, unshakable pride, and impenetrable armor, tightened with a cold, unsettling premonition. That night, as the relentless wind howled its ancient lament through the empty, echoing halls of his immense palace, Og stood utterly alone, and though the great fires in his massive hearth still burned brightly, casting dancing shadows, the fierce biblical giant King of Bashan felt, for the very first time, the icy chill of something eternal, something utterly beyond his comprehension, drawing near. In Bashan, it was an unwritten law, a fundamental truth giants did not tremble. But now, the silence that enveloped his kingdom was profoundly different. It was not the peace of a land at rest. It was pressure, the kind of immense, unbearable pressure that relentlessly builds just before something monumental and inevitable breaks. The rumors continued, persistent and unnerving, like fine dust on a relentless wind. Light at first, easy to ignore, dismissed by the complacent and the confident. A merchant's servant might speak of it, then a soldier's distant cousin, then a wandering priest who returned from his travels pale, trembling, his usual stoicism shattered. All of them, regardless of their station, told the same chilling story: they're coming. But this was no ordinary army, no conventional force that Og understood. There were no massive siege towers lumbering on the horizon, no rhythmic, ominous war drums echoing across the plains, no glinting lines of polished horsemen preparing for charge. They walked, the reports insisted, like men who had already secured their victory, their steps imbued with an unnatural confidence. Some of these unsettling reports spoke of a vast sea that had miraculously opened, allowing them passage, only to close and swallow an entire empire whole, without a single sword being raised. Others recounted the tale of a prophet, Moses, who had ascended a mountain wreathed in fire and cloud, returning with a radiant glory, a man whose presence literally glowed with the divine. And now, a new leader had emerged in his place, not a bloodthirsty warlord, not a conventional king, but a man named Joshua. His name was spoken with a reverence that puzzled and infuriated Og. Og scoffed, his laughter echoing hollowly through his halls. "We are Bashan!" he roared, slamming his fist down on a stone table, making the goblets jump. "Let cannon tremble before us! We do not bow to mere wind and empty stories. We do not surrender to superstition." But the stories kept coming, relentless and undeniable. Jericho had fallen, its mighty walls collapsing not by brute force, but by the inexplicable power of sound itself. The kings of the Amorites, formidable rulers in their own right, had simply vanished, their kingdoms absorbed. And Israel, they sang, The reports were clear. Israel sang, not with the aggressive, war-mongering chants of battle, not with the furious roars of rage, but with worship. Their voices, carried on the wind, didn't demand victory. They declared it, as if it were already a settled fact. A scout, badly wounded and barely conscious, returned to Og's throne room, whispering urgently through parched lips, "My king." Their leader does not shout. He stands still, and yet, it feels as though the wind itself waits for his command. Another added, with a trembling voice, "They walk without fear, because they truly believe they are not alone. Their God walks among them." Og grew increasingly restless, his colossal frame unable to find comfort even on his iron bed. He summoned his most powerful priests. They burned vast quantities of pungent incense, performed elaborate rituals, and cast their sacred lots. But the very air in the palace remained heavy, oppressive. The sky outside, despite their incantations, remained unsettled, bruised with an unseen threat. In a fit of frustrated rage, Og struck one of his most trusted generals when the man, in a rare moment of fear, dared to ask, "What if their God is real, my king?" But late at night, alone in his chambers, the mighty Og, the Titan of Bashan, found himself staring eastward into the encroaching darkness. He wondered, with a chilling apprehension that pierced his armor of pride, what kind of army marches without weapons drawn? What kind of people prepare for war by singing? And why? Why did the oppressive darkness, so familiar and comforting, seem thinner, less potent, near their camp? He thought again of his father's solemn voice, a distant echo from his youth. Giants fall hardest when they bow to no one. But Og had bowed to nothing, to no man, to no God, to no warning. Still, something deep in his very bones whispered, a truth he desperately tried to silence. This is no ordinary battle. Something holy is moving, and it will not stop for thrones, for crowns, or for giants. This was the approaching divine judgment, an inevitable force that even the mighty Og could not avert. The fires of Bashan blazed higher than ever that night, licking at the edges of the dark sky. Torches, thousands of them, lined every imposing wall of Og's fortresses, transforming them into a formidable, almost glowing spectacle of defiance. Drums pounded with a relentless, thundering rhythm through the vast courtyards, their primal beat a desperate attempt to drown out the growing unease. Tables, groaning under the weight of roasted meats and overflowing goblets of dark wine, suggested a grand celebration, a display of unshakable strength before the anticipated storm. But on the great throne of iron, King Og was quiet. He lifted his goblet, the same hand that had once effortlessly torn through enemy lines and crushed the wills of lesser men. Yet, the grip was different now, not weaker, for Og was still a titan, but unmistakably uncertain. The forced feast continued around him, a desperate attempt at normalcy. Yet, his piercing eyes drifted beyond the massive stone columns, beyond the swirling smoke of the braziers to the distant horizon. There, across the vast, dark valley, the camp of Israel stood in stark, silent contrast. No fires raged, no blades gleamed with aggressive intent. There were only faint, ethereal voices, rising like sacred incense into the night, singing. A captain, usually bold and unwavering, approached, his voice hesitant. "My king?" he began. "They don't prepare like we do. They don't shout battle cries. They don't sharpen swords with furious intent. They read, they sing, they pray." Og didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the imposing iron bed that rested beneath him, 13 feet long, nearly 6 feet wide. It had been forged not for rest, but as a monument, a declaration to the world of his unassailable strength, a physical manifestation of his unique, formidable being. But tonight, it felt colder, heavier, less like a symbol of power, and more like an ominous weight, perhaps even a premonition of a tomb. He stood abruptly and left the raucous hall, choosing to walk alone along the upper wall of his fortress. The wind was sharp, cutting through the thin air. The stars, usually a brilliant canopy above Bashan, were hidden behind thick, oppressive clouds. The land below was eerily silent, yet something moved within that silence. Not a sound, but an undeniable presence. Not fear, not terror, but something far deeper, far more profound: conviction. He had mocked their stories, laughed at their sacred songs, dismissed their God as a mere desert myth, a fabrication of a desperate, wandering people. But now, as the pure, unadulterated sound of worship rose from Israel's tents, Og, the biblical giant king, felt something grip his very soul. It was not a sword, not a curse, but a profound, undeniable truth. This was no mere war of nations, no simple clash of armies or kingdoms. This was a reckoning, a moment meticulously written into the fabric of time long before Og himself was ever born. Back in his private chamber, he unsheathed his great sword, a weapon longer than most men were tall. It had been his companion in countless victories. It had won him cities, had crushed kings, and had carved out his vast empire. But in his hands now, it felt wrong, unfamiliar, as if it no longer belonged to him, as if it resisted his very grip. He looked eastward again, and into the profound darkness. He whispered a prayer, not to God, not to any deity he acknowledged, but to silence itself. "If I fall," he muttered, his voice raw with a desperate, burgeoning understanding, "let them remember that I stood." But the silence offered no answer, only the relentless wind and the palpable presence that drew nearer with every agonizing breath, signaling the impending Ziri's divine judgment. The dawn did not break gently over Bashan. It split the sky with a brutal, almost violent intensity. The sun rose over Og's formidable kingdom, like a sword drawn from heaven itself, sharp, burning, and utterly silent. But the usual sounds of morning were eerily absent. No birds chirped their cheerful songs, no gentle breeze rustled through the ancient trees, just an oppressive stillness. Even the wild animals had vanished, having instinctively fled the unseen force. Og stood on the battlements of Edrei, his capital city, watching the valley below. His warriors, thousands upon thousands of them, stood ready, their swords polished to a gleaming finish, their armor strapped tight, their shields forming an impenetrable line, like iron waves across the field. But none of them cheered, none of them boasted, because Israel had come. They had arrived not with catapults, not with thunderous battle cries, but with a profound, unsettling silence. A long, unbroken line of men walked forward in perfect, unwavering formation, a sight that defied all conventional military understanding. There were no chariots, no trumpets, no overt display of fear. And then, rising like a subterranean thunder, a sound that seemed to emanate from beneath the very surface of the world, came their voices, worship. Not noise, not threats, not aggressive shouts, but pure, unadulterated reverence. Faith transmuted into sound. Og felt it before his mind could fully comprehend it. The palpable pressure in the air, the subtle but undeniable trembling beneath the ancient stones of his fortress, a pervasive heaviness not caused by the sheer number of Israelite soldiers, but by an overwhelming holiness. One of his elder priests, a man of profound wisdom and ancient knowledge, gasped, his voice barely a whisper, "My king, heaven itself is watching." Og said nothing, his gaze fixed on the approaching line, because he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was not merely an army approaching. This was the omnipresent, unyielding presence of God. Then he saw him, Joshua. He was not marching at the head of a charging army, not shouting commands, just standing. His staff was held firmly in his hand, his eyes steady and unwavering, his posture firm and resolute. And behind him, though unseen by mortal eyes, was a power that Og could no longer deny, a force that transcended all earthly understanding. The massive sword in Og's hand suddenly felt unfamiliar, alien. It resisted him, as if refusing to rise, refusing to obey its master's will. His breath caught in his throat. His heart raced, pounding against his ribs, but not with the exhilarating rush of courage he was accustomed to. No, it was with a crushing, absolute conviction. Then the wind shifted. It swept through the valley like a divine breath, lifting fine dust, bending ancient trees, and pulling the very sky downward in an profound, almost sacred silence. No trumpet sounded, no spear flew through the air, but the entire earth seemed to hold its breath. For just a single, agonizing moment, all of creation paused, as if waiting for a command not from man, but from heaven itself. Og gritted his teeth, not out of anger or defiance, but out of an overwhelming, visceral dread. He had openly mocked this god, dismissed him as a foolish myth. Now, he stood on what he knew in his soul was holy ground. And Bashan, with all its unyielding stone, its towering pride, its formidable iron, and its echoing roar, trembled uncontrollably because the God of Israel had arrived. And Og, once the terror of nations, stood not before mere men, but before the Almighty. This was the ultimate God vs Pride's confrontation. Og stood at the mighty gates of Edrei, his head unadorned by a crown, his colossal frame unburdened by armor, holding only a sword that now felt impossibly heavy, and confronting a silence that was deafening in its intensity. Behind him, his elite warriors waited, not with their usual confidence and battle-hardened resolve, but with palpable confusion and growing unease. The thunderous drums of Bashan had gone quiet, their defiant rhythm replaced by an unnerving stillness. The great fires that usually roared in the courtyards no longer blazed. Even the wind, so often a companion in battle, seemed to stop just short of the fortress walls, creating an eerie pocket of unnatural calm. Across the valley, the Israelites no longer marched. They stood utterly still, a silent, unmoving multitude. Every face was turned toward Og's formidable stronghold, every voice hushed into reverent silence, except one, Joshua. He now walked forward alone, a solitary figure against the vast landscape. There was no shield, no blade strapped to his side, just the steady, measured steps of a man who knew, with an absolute certainty, that he was not walking alone. Behind him, moving invisibly, was a presence. Unseen, yes, but profoundly, powerfully felt by Og in his very bones. It was immovable, an unshakable force that radiated an undeniable holiness. Og could have charged. He could have struck with the force of 1,000 men. He could have swung the colossal sword that had made kingdoms bow and shattered armies. But when he raised it, his mighty arms betrayed him. The colossal strength he had always trusted, the strength that had once shattered stone walls and torn through human flesh, no longer answered his command. His grip faltered. His knees, which had never buckled in battle, now shook uncontrollably. And then, his great sword, that symbol of his unyielding power, dropped from his grasp. It fell not by force, not from an enemy blow, but by something far deeper, far more devastating conviction. He looked into Joshua's eyes, and there was no fear, no hatred, no anger, only pure unadulterated truth. Og saw it then, with a clarity that cut through his pride, clearer than the highest peaks of Bashan or the deep scars etched upon his body. This moment, this ultimate confrontation, was never truly about Israel. It wasn't about swords or kings, numbers or strategies. It was about pride, his unyielding, colossal pride, meeting the unapproachable holiness of God. The formidable walls of Bashan, though physically still standing, no longer seemed to listen to his voice, no longer responded to his will. The very SS iron bed that stood behind him, his symbol of power, now felt colder than stone, no longer a seat of triumph, but a chilling premonition of a tomb of arrogance. And the sky, still silent, was no longer distant. It felt intimately close, filled with a divine presence. Joshua raised his hand, not to strike, not to issue a command for war, but to seal what heaven had already decreed. The earth beneath them trembled, not from the concussion of war machines, but from the immense, terrifying weight of Th's divine judgment. The cracks in Bashan began from within, not from battering rams, but from the internal collapse of a kingdom built on defiance. Og took one agonizing step, not to fight, not to flee, but to fall. He dropped to his knees, his hands, once unshakable instruments of war, now open and empty, palms facing the ground. His breath became shallow, ragged, his face pressed against the dust, and the Sarah's biblical giantess, the last of the Rephaim, fell. He fell not to a sword, not to a man, but to the overwhelming, inescapable presence of the God he had once mocked, the God whose very existence he had dared to deny. The last of the Rephaim was no longer standing, because when holiness arrives, when God reveals his glory, no flesh, no matter how mighty, can stand and boast. This was the true meaning of the guest's fall of King Og. The vast battlefield was eerily still. There were no triumphant cries of conquest, no exultant songs of victory, only a profound, heavy, and holy silence. The massive gates of Bashan, once impenetrable, now hung open, shattered not by siege engines or battering rams, but by the sheer force of surrender, by the spiritual weight of a truth too great to bear. The imposing iron bed, that chilling monument to Og's pride, stood untouched within the ruined chamber, its long, cold shadow stretching across the broken floor. And Og himself was gone, vanished from the earth. But the immense weight of what had just transpired lingered in the very air, like the acrid smoke after a devastating fire, a palpable reminder of a pride that had met its ultimate end. The people of Bashan, dazed and disoriented, emerged slowly from their homes, their eyes wide with disbelief, their hearts uncertain and filled with a profound sense of loss and fear. They looked not to Joshua, nor to the silent ranks of the Israelites, but to the empty space where their colossal king had once stood, a figure they had believed to be unshakable, eternal. He had fallen, without a single blade being raised against him, without a single blow struck by human hand. Og's formidable sword lay half buried in the dirt, discarded and unclaimed, now nothing more than a rusted piece of metal. His magnificent iron bed still stood, silent and bare beneath the broken roof of his palace. It no longer declared power or invited awe. Instead, it whispered a chilling warning, a desolate testament to the emptiness of human pride. An elder priest, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and newfound understanding, finally broke the profound silence. "Leave it," he commanded, his voice raspy. "Let the world remember what happens when man builds without fear of God." And they did. Israel did not loot the fallen kingdom. They did not dance in triumph or boast of their victory. They walked through Bashan with a profound reverence, their heads bowed, their eyes cast low. This was not their glory, this was God's judgment, a divine intervention that transcended human warfare. Even the very land responded. The brooding skies cleared, the ancient trees stilled their rustling leaves, and the wild animals returned from their hiding places, as if an immense, oppressive weight of arrogance had been miraculously rolled away from the earth itself. The once mighty cities of Bashan would not be rebuilt. No new king would rise from Og's ashes, for his legacy was utterly dissolved, not in fire and brimstone, but in the profound, crushing silence of his fall, because what fell that day was not just a man, not just a king, It was an idea, a dangerous philosophy. The belief that strength could stand entirely on its own, that pride could serve as a better, more enduring foundation than humble faith in the Almighty. For generations to come, the Israelites would remember this monumental event, not as a mere victory of men, but as a sacred moment when heaven itself stepped into human history. The story would be told again and again, not of Og the powerful ruler, but of Og the solemn warning. And from his desolate ruins, one eternal truth would echo with unyielding clarity: no fortress is too strong, no throne too high, no king too mighty, no giant too colossal, that the Lord cannot humble him in a single, devastating breath. This was the ultimate demonstration of God's power. After all the noise of battle preparations faded, after the dust settled over the vast plains, and after the silent warriors of Israel had moved on, one object remained untouched, standing as a stark, solitary sentinel. It was Og's bed. Iron. Immense. Cold. 13 feet long, nearly 6 feet wide, too massive for any human comfort, too heavy for any ordinary man to even contemplate moving. It had been forged, not for a peaceful night's rest, but as a monument to his terrifying presence, a chilling declaration designed to intimidate, to pronounce, "Here lies one who is beyond comparison, beyond challenge." Scripture itself would meticulously record its colossal size, not to glorify Og, but to ensure that all future generations would remember what kind of pride, what magnitude of defiance, God had so powerfully brought down. Because now, that very bed stood beneath an open sky, its once magnificent canopy gone, its chamber crumbled into dust, and Og, the king, nowhere to be found. The bed had transformed from a symbol of greatness into a chilling relic of arrogance. It had once been his throne, his personal symbol of unyielding power, his irrefutable proof that he was more than a mere man. And now, ironically, it served as a grave, not of his physical body, for his body was lost to the earth, but of his legacy, his pride, and his defiant spirit. Israel didn't seize it as a spoil of war. They didn't melt it down for their own use or carry it off in triumph. They left it, standing as a permanent fixture in the desolate landscape, because some things, some monuments, are not meant to be trophies of victory. They are meant to be warnings. And that iron bed, still standing even though the king who owned it had fallen so spectacularly, spoke louder than any triumphal song. It reminded every passerby, every child who heard the story, every warrior who gazed upon it, this is where pride sleeps. This is what remains when a man or a nation builds without the fear of God. Og's formidable sword had rusted into oblivion. His crown had vanished. His once impenetrable walls were broken, crumbling into disrepair. But the bed remained, not because it was inherently strong, but because God, in his sovereign wisdom, allowed it to endure as a profound message, not to inspire fear of Og, but awe of the one who does not need vast armies to bring down colossal kingdoms, who does not need sharp swords to break seemingly unbreakable strongholds, who humbles the mighty not by shouting thunderous commands, but by simply showing them, in his quiet, irresistible way, who truly rules over all. And every time the wind swept through the haunting ruins of Bashan, every time someone paused to stare at that lonely, immense frame of iron, they remembered a timeless truth. God does not forget pride, and those who exalt themselves, who build their lives on their own might, will ultimately be brought low. When as biblical giantesses fall, the earth remembers, not because of the earth shaking noise they make when they hit the ground, but because of the profound, eternal truth their fall reveals, the unmatched sovereignty of God. King Og of Bashan wasn't just a giant in physical size. He was a mirror, a chilling warning wrapped in flesh and iron. He stood as a symbol for every kingdom built solely on human pride, every man who trusted implicitly in what he could build, what he could command, what he could measure with his own limited understanding. And in one single, devastating moment, without the drawing of a blade or the flight of an arrow, that image, that delusion of self-sufficiency, was utterly shattered. Why? Because God had arrived. Og defied Moses, the humble servant of God. He arrogantly dismissed the God of Israel as a mere desert myth, a figment of a wandering people's imagination. He placed all his trust in his immense height, in the unyielding strength of iron, in the deep-rooted legacy of his ancient lineage. But all of it, his physical strength, his mighty sword, his iron throne, his towering fortresses, all of it crumbled before a divine presence he couldn't see, couldn't fight, but could no longer resist. And isn't that still profoundly true today? How many of us, in our modern lives, build our own iron beds? We construct careers, reputations, amass control, accumulate measurable things that we mistakenly believe will last forever, providing us with ultimate security and comfort. But if God is not the master builder, if His will is not the blueprint, then those walls, no matter how impressively constructed, will inevitably fall. We, much like Og, too often put our ultimate faith in the visible, the tangible, the things we can touch and measure. But God, the Almighty, consistently moves through what is unseen, through the quiet conviction of faith, through the subtle shifting of circumstances, through the very breath of His Spirit. Israel did not defeat Og with overwhelming numbers, with superior weaponry, or with brilliant tactical strategies. They didn't need massive siege towers or clever maneuvers. They marched in a profound silence, filled with an unshakable faith. They sang in worship, declaring God's victory before a single blow was struck. And because of that unwavering trust, God Himself fought for them. That is the core, timeless lesson the story of Bashan teaches us, not just that human biblical giants fall, but that only God stands forever, unmoving, unchanging, eternally sovereign. So, when you find yourself walking through the challenging valleys of your life, when the opposition you face looks too big, too loud, too powerful, too insurmountable, remember this story. It's not ultimately about how strong your enemy appears to be, or how formidable the challenge seems. It's about who walks with you, who stands behind you, and in whom you place your absolute trust. Og was brought down not by men, but by the holy, undeniable weight of divine righteousness, by the very presence of the Almighty. And that same immeasurable power, that same unyielding presence, still walks with those who trust wholeheartedly in the Lord today. So, I invite you to ask yourself, with deep introspection, what iron beds have you unwittingly built in your own life? What thrones of pride have you fiercely defended, believing them to be unassailable monuments to your own strength or ingenuity? And most critically, what will you do? How will you respond when God, in His sovereign timing, comes walking through your own Bashan, confronting the very foundations of your self-reliance? Because when giants fall, whether they are physical or metaphorical, it's not the earth-shattering sound of their collapse that truly matters. It's the profound, lingering silence that follows. It's the moment when only one is left standing, the one who always has been standing, the one who always will be. For when the throne of human pride falls silent, the eternal, all-encompassing voice of God is all that truly remains, reverberating across the ages, a testament to His unrivaled glory.